Great. So I want to spend some time really talking about thematic text analysis. So my plan is to describe just, conceptually what we do and how we really move from this purpose of taking a lot of qualitative data, which is dense text data, and moving through a process of coding and then ultimately identifying themes in that. And then after this, I'm going to briefly show software, Max QDA software specifically, and how we might use that and really leverage that in the analysis process. So starting with a little bit of just what qualitative research is, just to kind of get into the mindset of thinking qualitatively. Um, in qualitative research, we're studying a single central phenomenon and kind of all aspects of that. So as we're analyzing, it's important to sort of keep this in mind. So we're studying this central phenomenon, this thing that we're studying based on our research questions. We'll be trying to draw the actual voices of participants in the form of quotes. Of course, data is often collected, from participants in the actual setting, and we might be interested in things like how a process unfolds over time. So in qualitative research, we often focus on a smaller number of sites in order to achieve depth. And part of the reason we tend to have smaller sample sizes is because that gives us the advantage of looking at complexity. And that's part of our goal in analysis, really uncovering that complexity and developing our understanding. And again, I'll emphasize it's a way to sort of bring voices to the front. So we're able to really focus, in the words of our participants, how they describe their experiences with whatever it is we're studying. Through doing so, we often have multiple perspectives, and we want to capture that in analysis. So some refer to this as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And it doesn't have to be that dramatic or that drastic, but often we have different stakeholders and we have different perspectives, and that's not a bad thing. It's something that we want to make sure we capture and represent in analysis, and especially if there's a way to maybe compare and contrast different views that we have. So just to dispel any kind of myth, though, qualitative research is systematic and can certainly follow a systematic process that we see in any type of research, where we identify a particular research problem we're trying to address, we pose questions, collect and analyze data, and then use that to offer findings and then conclusions and interpretations. So our focus here, though, is really on analysis, and that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about going forward. So our skill here is really to develop the skill of coding text data, and then also identifying themes as we're coding data. So the process that I'm showing is really a process of thematic text analysis, and that's been described by multiple individuals, John Cresswell, Kukarts, Braun and Clark. It's all a fairly similar process. There are other approaches to qualitative research, but thematic text analysis is kind of a common and also very popular approach to analyzing this type of data. And coding in particular is important because the data that we collect qualitatively is often text data, and that's very dense. So you're familiar with how long a transcript could be from a short conversation or even short written reflections. So part of our goal is to parse that out and then try to make sense of it and assemble it back in a meaningful way. Of course, text data also involves some interpretation, and that's much of what we're using qualitatively. So let me just, kind of briefly talk about the overall process, and then we'll go through these steps in a little bit more detail. So starting with preparing the data. So we have to make sure that it's ready for analysis, whether we're using software or doing this by hand. And then we have general procedures of data analysis that we go through, which includes coding the data. So a code is a short label for a segment of text, and we can reuse codes over and over. We then think about themes. So themes are what I think of as findings from a qualitative research study. So these are looking at relationships among codes, identifying patterns of the data in order to generate some of those findings. I will show qualitative analysis software and really talk about how that can be beneficial as well. And I also want to touch on the use of multiple individuals who are coding the data and how we might ensure that we have consensus among individuals. Of course, there are some other steps in qualitative research, like checking the validity of our findings, checking the accuracy, and then also being transparent about who we are and what we've really brought to the research as well. So I think of the process as going from raw data to codes is kind of like this. So we're collecting data, let's just say it's notes or transcripts or audio recordings. We then prepare that for analysis. So making sure that it's formatted in an appropriate way, again, whether we're doing analysis by hand or if we're bringing data into software, that we have it set up correctly. And then we read through the data. So this is kind of my first step, actually. Before actually coding data, before thinking about themes, I read through what's been collected in order to get a general sense of it. So if you have multiple transcripts, multiple files, you might start with a few and read through them just to kind of gain a general sense of it. And in doing so, try to withhold any desire to code initially, just to kind of formulate an idea of what you're seeing within the data. And then we're actually coding data. So this is a process of locating segments of text, and we bracket those either by hand or in software, and we assign a code to them. And a code is really a label. It's a label for a unit of meaning of qualitative data. We'll talk more about codes a little bit later, but that's really what a code is. And we're coding in a couple of different ways, actually. So for one, we're coding for descriptions. So descriptions to be used in a report. So describing a little bit of the role of our participants and who they are, what the setting is, other contextual factors that surround our research, for instance. If you're doing interviews in healthcare settings, it might be coding as far as someone's role with a particular condition, whether they're a nurse, a physician, and so on, what they do. And then we're also coding thematically. So these types of codes are really related to our research questions that we're trying to address in these sorts of codes. And this really makes up the bulk of the codes, but this is what's going to ultimately help us identify those themes that we're going to be using in a research report. Now, you'll see on the sides of this figure here, it notes that this process is interactive and simultaneous. So those are important. So for one, the simultaneous nature means that generally in qualitative research, we can start analyzing data as we're collecting it. So unlike quantitative research, you don't have to wait until all data are collected before you start to analyze it. And then two, it's interactive. And it's interactive, meaning that we often iterate between these steps. So again, think about as we're coding data, as we're analyzing it, we might identify that there's a gap and maybe we need to collect more data. Or as we're adding more and more transcripts or data to code, sometimes we might need to add codes to our code book, or we might decide we need to look for new patterns or new themes. So that iteration is part of what makes qualitative analysis more interactive in that way. And that's just commonly how it's conducted. So from going from the raw data to the themes, I think of, when you're embarking on analysis and embarking on coding, it's important to keep the end product in mind. So for most of us, we want to write a manuscript at the end of the day. And within that manuscript, we're going to have a results or a findings section. And in that section, we're going to report the major themes. So again, these are the major findings. And within those passages, you'll see quotes from individuals. You might see tables that accompany it. So Ultimately, as we're analyzing our data and as we're coding it, I like to keep that end product in mind. So remembering that we want to be sure and identify some quotes that we might want to use. We want to make sure that our codes are relevant to our research questions and really relevant to identifying themes that are going to be important to us. And I generally use a process called lean coding, and this is something that Cresswell recommends. And this means that we try to have a more parsimonious set of codes. So sometimes people will come to me with a project and they might have 100, 200 different codes, and it's very difficult to make sense of that. So I tend to recommend a smaller set of codes actually. And we'll talk about how you get to that point going forward. So I think of the process is sort of like winnowing the data. And that's what I'm trying to represent here actually. So remember, we're first reading through the data. So we might have many segments of text, many pages of text, and then we're dividing it into segments of information. So that division is important when reading qualitative data, especially something like a transcript. Resist the urge to have to code everything. You don't have to code data that's unrelated to your research questions. And part of that just happens. Sometimes individuals will sort of go off on tangents. Sometimes you'll just have, extraneous information. For instance, you don't have to code that. So we're really thinking about, again, breaking this down and finding the relevant segments of text that we want to use. And then we label that with codes. So a code, again, is just a short label, usually 2 to 3 words. That's not a hard rule, but that's sort of a target. And we define that code and what it is and when we're going to apply it. So often we might start with a larger set of codes. We might have 30 to 40 codes. And again, we're reusing those as we're analyzing more data, as we're going through the rest of our transcripts or our data set. But I recommend then looking for overlap and redundancy of those codes and reducing it to a more manageable parsimonious set. So this says 20, I would say that 20 to 30 codes tends to be a little bit more manageable. And then we can look at those codes and look for patterns. We can also look for how they might collapse or how some codes might group into a larger concept. And that's helpful for identifying themes. And again, these aren't hard rules. I'm saying 20 to 30 codes as guidance. And similarly, trying to find maybe 5 to 7 themes at the end of your analysis. And again, you might just have 3 or 4 themes, or you might have 8 themes, and that's okay too. But it's just a target to give you a target to shoot for. So coding is this process again, by which we're analyzing text by really taking it apart and then trying to make meaning of it and reassemble it in a meaningful way. I think of especially reporting qualitative research is kind of like reporting a chain of evidence where you have your descriptions and you also have your themes. So themes, again, are these major findings. And then we're using codes as evidence for those themes. So we're using quotes from individuals as evidence for those codes, for instance. So we're trying to show that logic, and that really helps the reader to understand how you arise or how you developed, how you arrived at those final themes that you did. So codes themselves, though, can be identified in several different ways. It's probably preferred to have our codes that are derived directly from the data. So by that, I mean that we're really saying what it's sometimes called, what emerges from the data, but what exists in the data. And then we're creating codes based on that. So, if someone is talking about a particular process, they're talking about providing care to, sick patients with, multiple conditions, for instance. we might have a code that's based on that. Trying to use the words of our participant interviewees as much as possible. Sometimes in certain situations, we might decide that we want to actually count up instances of those codes, but that tends to not be used very often in thematic analysis. And it's often because, converting something to counts tends to be less meaningful. The frequencies itself doesn't often mean a lot. Now, if you're looking at things like discourse, actual language that's used, and you've collected data in an appropriate way, that might be okay to use. But there is sometimes some value in just looking at relative frequencies of how often a concept comes up. So, a study that I've been part of for a number of years, looking at in-hospital cardiac arrest processes. So, one of our most frequently occurring codes was about formal training activities. So, that's important. It's important just to know how often that does come up and how often it comes up in certain sites relative to others, but we're more interested in what people say as opposed to how often they say it. So then the final way that you might identify codes is based on some sort of existing theory or literature. So these are thought of as more a priori codes. So as a researcher, you identify things that you're going to look for, and you're coding the data looking for those sorts of things. So that's okay to do. And in fact, sometimes it's helpful to draw from theory and literature and that sort of thing. But if you are doing that, I would recommend that you're also open to identifying new codes that you're deriving directly from the data itself. So, let's look at a theme passage. And this is just sort of a general passage that I'm drawing from a Cresswell textbook, actually. But let's kind of work backwards from this theme passage to identify coding. Again, keeping this end point in mind that we want to be able to write a results or a findings section of our research. So I mentioned codes derived directly from the data. So sometimes we look at what people say and we interpret that and use it for a code. Sometimes we take their actual language that they use, and that's called an in vivo code. So in vivo is basically taking a quote from a participant, and we're going to make that a code. So in this findings section, we like to see in vivo language. You'll also see some evidence of codes that are embedded in this passage. We use quotes, and remember, thinking about this chain of evidence, we want to have quotes as supporting evidence for our codes and then also our themes, and then also that we're drawing from multiple data sources. So here's a passage from a study that was conducted, this was a number of years ago, and it was actually about a incidents of violence that was narrowly averted on a college campus. So if you look at this excerpt here from the actual study, it starts with this in vivo theme, and that's safety. So safety was the actual theme, one of the themes that arose out of this project. And I won't read all of this to you, but let me just point out a few features. So we see here that the violence in the city that involved university students and the gun incident that occurred on campus shocked the typically tranquil campus. Now, for our purposes here, I've italicized the codes that are embedded in this passage. Normally, you wouldn't, do that necessarily, but I wanted you to see that there are actually codes that are embedded in this passage about this theme of safety. So then continuing on, a counselor happily summed up the feeling, quote, when many students walked out of the classroom, their world had become very chaotic, it had become random, and so on. So that, again, is an actual quote. So it's a quote from a participant, and it's used, it's from a counselor, so there's an attribution, we know who it comes from, but that's used then to provide more evidence of this. And then again, I won't read through all of this, but if you continue on, you'll see now another data source coming in. So this is a quote from a student chief student affairs officer, and then continuing on to some statements from university administration and so on. So we see multiple sources of evidence. So if you're wondering how this applies then to the process of coding, when you're coding data, for one, I recommend that when you're coding data, you identify potential quotes as you see them. So you might actually have a code called quote. And in this case, they might have coded it with Tranquil Campus, but then they also coded that, marked it as a potential quote. It's a lot easier to find quotes that you might want to use in your finding section, if, in my opinion, if you mark them as you're going along, as you're analyzing data. So if you see something that's well said, you could see maybe including that, then as you're coding, I would identify that, I would note that. But then also just keep in mind that at the end of the day, we need to report our findings, and we're going to be reporting major themes. So if it doesn't seem relevant to that, you don't actually have to code it. So the process of coding, I'll go through these steps kind of quickly before we move over to the software and talk a little bit about agreement. First is the setup. So I generally recommend that if you have a transcript, you have some margins on the side of it, it just tends to ease readability of it. You might add a header, and at the header, you can note things like who was doing the interview, who was interviewed. That likely has to be de-identified, but you might instead note the role of an individual or a participant identifier. Sometimes we replace things like, P1, P2, P3 to keep people distinct. If you're coding by hand, you might set up a system where you might identify codes in the left-hand margins, themes on the right-hand margins, or vice versa. If you're using software, that's, of course, not an issue. I generally suggest that a transcript is double spaced as well. It, again, just often makes it easier to read, easier to import, but some of that's a style issue. And then I tend to request that transcriptionists distinguish between the questions and the responses. So I usually like to have, anytime the interviewer is talking, I prefer that to be bolded. And when the interviewee is responding, that's unbolded. And that does a couple of things. For one, it's sort of a really quick quality check that you can look at a transcript because you don't want to see a lot of bold on that page. We want to make sure that the participant is talking a lot more than the interviewer. Two, it just makes it cognitively a little easier when you're coding to focus on when the participant is talking, because again, we're not really interested in coding when the interviewer is talking. So it's just a way to break that up a little bit more. And then read through the text, ask what are people saying or doing. By hand, you might record a few notes in the margin. If you're in software, you might take some notes in a memo or in another page, and then code each text. If you have multiple transcripts or documents to start from, I would recommend just starting with kind of the easiest, most straightforward ones. That's a way to really develop your initial code book rather than starting with an interview that was maybe more complex or included tangents, for instance. And then as you're reading it, you're bracketing the text either by hand or in software and assigning that code label. So that code is something that you create. Sometimes this is called open coding, actually. So you're reading the data, and that is called open coding because it opens the analysis, actually. So as you're reading data, you're identifying those codes and you're assigning those code labels. I recommend coding chunks of data. Now, a chunk is vague and, of course, has many definitions. And what that means somewhat depends on your project and your own preferences. But generally, a chunk of data is not just a single word. It's often more of a phrase or a sentence or a few sentences, could be a little bit longer. On the other extreme, I generally don't recommend coding something like a full page. or multiple pages, because you're not really breaking down the data at that point very much. And if you're using software or even not using software, remember the next step is to actually read through that text you've coded. And if you've coded these very, very large chunks of data, it's really just like you're reading the transcript all over again. So remember, keeping that in mind, that we're trying to winnow down the data. And again, keeping in mind this idea of lean coding. So we want to have maybe 20 to 30 codes at the end of this. So as you're coding your data, there will be some parts that seem relevant and some parts that maybe seem less relevant. So I recommend applying code to sort of the relevant part. So, cut some of the extraneous material. If a conversation kind of drifts off at the end of a line, you don't need to code that unless it's really important to have that context for some reason. And the other point that I want to make, and this is kind of a common trap to fall into, whether you could apply multiple codes to the same segment of text. And I would suggest that you do that in limited capacities. So I talked briefly about this study of in-hospital cardiac arrest processes. So sometimes as people were talking, they were discussing a resuscitation team, and we had codes related to the personnel on the team and also the function of the team. So often that was just very hard to tease apart because people were talking about who did what, so their function kind of at the same time. So those are cases where we might have applied both of those codes. But again, I suggest doing so sparingly and really think about what is this person saying here? What does it mean? And then selecting, to the extent possible, the one single code that applies to that. So here's just an example of a passage. This is from an observation, actually, where doing it by hand, you might have the codes on the left-hand side, the themes on the right-hand side. It's an example by a study of Cresswell's, actually. If you're using software, again, this is not really needed. It's not really necessary, but you'll note here a quote, for instance, is one of the codes. So if you do identify some potential quotes as you're coding it, you might want to use that. So then code each text, and again, thinking about different types of codes. So codes that are in vivo, so drawing directly from the words of participants. Someone you're analyzing data, and it's someone who's talked about depression, for instance, but maybe they use the term feeling blue or feeling down. So that would be an in vivo code that you might use, where coding has major depressive disorder. That's more of a researcher identified sort of code. But we're really trying to highlight the voice of participants to the extent possible. You can also just draw codes from the experiences of individuals. So not necessarily lifting direct quotes, but really based on what you're seeing. And then again, it is okay to draw codes from theory, from literature, and so on. But if you're doing that, again, I would at least be open to identifying some additional codes. So as you're coding, then think about, again, having that code for quote, which I think is really important. And then as you're thinking about what sorts of codes to use, code for things that are expected, also things that are surprising or unexpected or unusual. So qualitative research gives you the ability to sort of look at nuanced details of something. So it's a way to look at things from a different angle. If something surprised you, for instance, that might be something that's important to code and important to note. And again, going back to the slide we sort of first started with, how this whole process is interactive, it's okay to think about some themes as you go along as well. So you might see some themes, some patterns that you're starting to notice. You might identify some themes early, and it's okay to note those as well. So I would suggest that you do that. So, as we're coding, we develop what's called a code book. So this is really just a list of codes. It can be done on a separate document, something like an Excel spreadsheet. And then, of course, if you're using software, the software keeps track of codes for you. So after you have the code book, after you've applied that code to your data, and it's okay to add new codes as you're coding more transcripts. I will say though, if you add new codes, you need to then go back to those other transcripts and make sure that you haven't missed cases where you should add that new code actually. But after you've done that, after you've coded the data, think about how these codes group into patterns. For one, look for to try to get to a more lean code set, look for redundancy and overlap. So here are just some examples from that passage I showed you a few minutes ago. It was about a climbing gym, actually. So there were codes about physical structure, the wall is a piece of art, and then also the closeness of the wall. All of those were kind of synonymous. They were all saying the same things. So those could be collapsed, for instance, into a single code. The next one here, trust, teamwork, the buddy system. So all of those are about these teamwork sort of principles. So again, those could be collapsed or maybe combined into just a single code, unless you think it's important to distinguish those, if there's some reason to distinguish those, of course. The software actually makes it very easy, though, to combine codes if that is something that you're using and something that would be helpful. Um, if you combine codes, remember that it's then sort of hard to go back the other way. So if you are trying to decide between whether to parse something into separate codes or to group it into a larger code, I would probably recommend at least initially parsing it, because again, it's going to be hard to go back later on without recoding those text segments. So as you're grouping this and identifying themes, you might just ask some general questions related to your research questions. What did you expect to see? What's surprising? What's unusual? These are meant just to sort of prompt your thinking actually as you're identifying different themes. And part of it is to help challenge any of your preconceived notions about what you thought you would see, to make sure that you're constantly kind of challenging that, so you're not just simply confirming what you thought you would see in the data, but that you're really letting the data kind of drive the analysis. And then write a theme passage from this, again using those codes as evidence for the themes, specific quotes as evidence for the codes, drawing from multiple sources of information, and then also citing, drawing quotes from different people. So I've emphasized having this quote code, so you're identifying these quotes as you go along. Personally, I find that in most studies, there are a few participants that I really, it's just a really good interview. You resonate well, they give good information. So it's really hard to resist the urge to just always drawing quotes from those individuals. Remember, when you report this, you want to make sure that you're representing the entire database and also representing multiple perspectives. So as you're coding for some of those quotes that you might use, again, be really cognizant of making sure that you're identifying those from multiple individuals, multiple transcripts, multiple pieces of data, for instance. So then, after you've identified your codes and themes, I would think about maybe a conceptual map. So how might these themes be interrelated in order to tell a story? Personally, I don't think of themes as being static and entirely mutually exclusive units of analysis. And in fact, themes tend to be interrelated to one another. So I would think about how they can be ordered in a logical way in order to tell a narrative, for instance. And you might even include a figure that illustrates that. So here's just a figure from that really simple example from the climbing gym. So we have starting with this physical description, then maybe talking about the process of scaling, and then how teamwork and motivation help to mediate that, and then concluding with some individual stories of people. Um, if you're using software, there are tools that can help you map out your codes really into a logical way. And again, a figure such as this can be included in a transcript as well. So, uh, some might say that coding is not qualitative analysis, and I partially agree with that. Coding is one important part of qualitative analysis. So coding is really critical, but then we also have to identify themes. We have to think about how these themes are related to one another. So it's really just more of conducting a thorough thematic analysis, and then developing this narrative, if you will, where you're summarizing your major themes. Sometimes as you're writing this, you might continue to refine your codes. You might decide that a code or a theme doesn't really seem to be complete. You need to revise it a little bit as you're writing to make it clear for the reader. And that's okay. And simply write this in a logical order. Sometimes we also include tables. Tables are a way to provide evidence of themes and then some illustrative quotes for those themes. So in summary, qualitative analysis is this series of steps really going from raw data to codes, and then from codes to themes. And then finally, we organize these themes into a narrative. So maybe I'll pause at this point and ask if there are any questions before I spend a couple of minutes talking about intercoder agreement and then demonstrating the software. Any questions?
Tim, thanks so much for doing this. This is incredibly useful to see. And just for your knowledge, I really appreciate the fact that Sydney's recording this. We had one of our coders have a family emergency, and one of our other coders was pulled in to cover her shift. So
okay.
We have 2 down that we will catch up, but this is a great overview. I think one of the things I'm finding very interesting is this concept of lean coding. Having been involved with one study that did end up having literally 300 codes, it was an incredible amount to just get your brain around to consolidate and form codes. Do you have any thoughts about how we set ourselves up for success in getting everyone on the same page as to what an appropriate coding unit looks like?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it kind of is starting to what I'm going into next is you have multiple individuals coding, but I recommend starting and having everyone on the team code the same transcript or maybe a couple of transcripts, and then setting aside a meeting, and that meeting's probably going to be an hour or two where you really just review line by line and reconcile some of that. So thinking about what's an appropriate size segment in order to code, what's kind of an appropriate level of abstraction for a code. So, a code could be really general, like process, or, it can be more fine grained, like process for activating a response, process for responding to something, process for feeding back quality improvement information, and so on. So thinking about what kind of level you're coding at, but I really recommend going through that as a team to kind of calibrate and having some of those conversations. And the software tends to make it, in my opinion, make it a little bit easier to adhere more to lean coding, because you have your list right there as it's building of how many codes you have, and as that starts to creep up and get larger, then I would suggest going through it. And I would suspect, in those studies where there were 300 codes, that if you look at those, there's probably a lot of synonyms actually and a lot of overlap there. in most of those studies that come to me, I see just a lot of overlap and redundancy that could be collapsed.
Yeah, we had a lot of many things around barriers to learning that was just ginormous in its subcategories. And I think we ultimately did end up collapsing them. And it sounds like you like people to code independently and then come together as opposed to work as a group.
I kind of prefer that initially, just because it sort of, gives everyone time to kind of get into a transcript, and depending on what experience level they have, to sort of familiarize with the process of coding. So I recommend independent coding initially, and then coming together as a team in order to review that.
To do the standardization and
Yeah,
pull everyone together. Okay, great.
exactly.
Thanks. That's helpful.
Yep. No, these are good questions. All right. So just a couple of thoughts on that process for any time that you have a team that's coding. And it's in qualitative research, usually referred to as intercoder agreement. So from a quantitative side, the corollary would be reliability, inter-rater reliability, but we usually use the term intercoder agreement in qualitative research. So the idea is that we have, some other person that's kind of checking the accuracy of our coding, and then also interpretation. So it's a check of consistency between usually two or more researchers. So it's a way to really look at reliability, and it can add some rigor to interpretations. Just thinking about that, different researchers are bringing a different perspective, and it is a way to kind of keep some ideas in check, especially if you're really close to a topic, really close to data. Having other individuals look at it can be helpful. So in an intercoder agreement, just kind of by definition, two or more people are analyzing this, providing codes, and then comparing results for agreement. So, to be honest, I'm a little apprehensive myself about intercoder agreement and reducing it to a percent of agreement, but I think the process is actually extremely valuable. So I suggest, though, that you do go through this process um, so that you are prepared to write about it in a manuscript and be able to describe that you went through some kind of an intercoder agreement exercise or consensus building exercise. So it is a way to add credibility and rigor to your research methods. Now, the software, qualitative data analysis software, can conduct that analysis for you, can actually calculate that percent for you. So just kind of a process. Of course, you have multiple analysts working on this. We usually have to have a code book established first before we can really calculate agreement. So this would be, after you go through that initial transcript or two, you have a code book. Then you might have an agreement exercise where you have two or more individuals use that code book and apply it to the same transcript, and then conduct this intercoder agreement exercise and determine if agreement exists or not. So one example here, 4 different coders analyzed and developed a preliminary code book. They then coded independently and really asked whether all have assigned the same code label for specific passages of text, specific segments of text. So the software, again, can do this for you. If you have the same transcript and people are using the same code book, it can calculate instances of agreement. So where it gets difficult, and this is where I sort of have issues with coder agreement, is that it's hard to figure out what counts as an agreement. So if you're using the same code book, then at least we have consistency among our codes, for instance. But let's say I selected the part where someone started and they said, well, I think that learning is hard for these reasons. And then the other person who coded it left out the well, and they, just started with the actual meat of the response. So do you count that as an agreement or not an agreement? So by most standards, if there's an overlap, and this is just a rough rule of thumb, but if there's an overlap of about 80% of that segment of text, it's counted as an agreement. And then again, it's sort of a rule of thumb, but Saldana and others have suggested that 80% agreement is kind of a standard that we try to look for in calculating, in our calculation of intercoder agreement. But again, I think it's really important to recognize the limitations of that number and of that percentage, just because it's really hard to tell, whether that overlap can be counted as an agreement or not. Now, if you don't have a code book to start, it gets even tougher. So, let's say I coded something as a team function, and then someone else identified a code function of the team. Well, I mean, clearly that's the same thing, but if we're just using software to calculate it, that would technically show that that was a disagreement, for instance. So that's why it's important to really have a code book established before you go through that. However, knowing all of those limitations of calculating the percent, just simply going through the process of having more than one person code a transcript and then just discuss line by line and reconcile differences and disagreements, that, in my opinion, is really valuable and really helpful. And I would describe that in a manuscript. I would describe it in a methods section while writing about my methods of analysis, and I would discuss that process of developing consensus. And then here's just a sample code book of what that might look like. Of course, the software will develop a code book for you, but you might have it organized if you are using, say, Excel or a Word table, where you would have your codes, which can be divided into parent codes and then even subcodes if you want to, a clear definition for each code. So as you create a new code, define it. So provide a description of what that is. And going so far as if it's a code that's really specific, what would be included, what would be excluded, and you might even have some example excerpts of text for when you might actually use this code as well. So in my opinion, a good code book always has these definitions. Now, remember, qualitative analysis is iterative, so it is okay to refine those definitions over time. And in fact, some of these conversations will come up after you've made it through a few transcripts where you think, well, this code kind of applies, but it's maybe a little bit too restrictive. So, maybe it was so in your example earlier, particular barrier to learning, but then you're wondering, well, do we add a new code or can we force this other code into it? And if you do that, you of course would need to then adjust your definition and revise your definition. All right, so again, intercoder agreement is just a way to check consistency between coders where they independently code and compare. I do recommend that you go through the exercise again for a couple of reasons. For one, I do find just that discussion, that consensus building to be really, really valuable. Two, if you're in a situation where maybe you have editors or reviewers of a manuscript and they really, really are insisting on reporting an intercoder agreement, if you've done this appropriately ahead of time, you will be able to provide that number if needed. Even noting that, our initial agreement was 50%, but then we, met, refined the code book and so on, and we were able to improve agreement. So, and again, there are limitations to that intercoder agreement, but sometimes it might, just be necessary. So let me pause again. Are there any questions about this before I flip over to MaxQDA? And I'm also happy to share these slides too, if that would be helpful for you. I do, let me just, rather than, talking about the software, let me just kind of jump over to it if that's okay, and just kind of demonstrate a few of the features of it. So
That sounds good. Tim, one thing I'd be
yeah,
particularly interested on is the best. So this does not, in my playing with it, it does not look as though you can uh, easily code in the cloud, so to speak. You'll have to create individual projects. So Sydney, sorry, I'm trying to call you Cindy all of a sudden, Cindy. It sounds like we'll need some instruction on how to best set up those individual projects so we can merge them back together.
Sure, happy to do that.
yeah, and that's what I would
Thank you.
suggest, just setting up his individual project and having one person who's responsible for the master file, and then as you divide it up, people are sending their projects to that master file. But it's not too hard to set up, and the software does a nice job of merging those. So Max QDA looks like this. This is just this is one of my studies. It's data actually from a trial of a program teaching communication skills, and we had a qualitative written reflection from all learners after that. So in this upper left-hand quadrant here, this is the document system in Max QDA. So the document system is where you bring in transcripts, whatever data you want to bring in. So as you click on these different files, it opens up in this document browser to the right of it. And this document browser is how you actually, read the data. So, whichever one you click on, it will open that and so on. In this lower left-hand quadrant, this is the code system. So these are all codes that I've set up for this project. So I'll come back to the code system in a minute, but let me just show briefly how you would bring data into this. So if you go to import, so there's this button for import, and then you can select, I want to import text. So it's this first icon here. You can navigate to whatever data you want to bring in. So I have a file on my desktop here. And I'm going to bring in this transcript sample right here. So I will click open. And it brought in this sample transcript. You can also drag and drop from a window directly to your document system. So here is my transcript over here. So this is set up where we have the question and then the respondent labeled. Again, I would prefer to have this bolded, but it's just existing data set that I had. So you can read through it. As you're reading through it, you can highlight segments of text to apply a code. So let me just jump over to one of the other documents that I've showed already. Let's start with this one. All right, so in this document browser, you see these little labels over here. So these are all, they're called coding stripes in the software, but these are codes that have been applied to that text. Now, some of these I had the system sort of automatically code for me because I was importing from a structured data set. So I have labeled what the question was, so what the prompt was for this written reflection. And then we had information about race from individuals. So this kind of takes us to the code system. So if you want to apply a code in the software, it's really easy. You just highlight a segment of text. So this segment of text, I didn't really think it helped with nonverbal communication. So I can go to my code system down here, and I can look through my existing codes and see if any one of these, might apply, for instance. So let's see, I think there should be one. And I'll do, it doesn't quite make sense, but this code was the parent code about useful verbal and nonverbal communication, even though they're saying it wasn't useful. So if I just grab this, so if I click and hold and drag it over to that segment of text, it applies the code. So right here, you see this now, useful verbal, and I'll make this a little bit bigger so you can see it. useful verbal and nonverbal communication. So that's the code that I just applied. So let me just go ahead and delete that. So if I right click on it, come down to delete, it's going to ask me if I'm sure I want to remove that. I'll click OK, so it removed that code. So that's if you have an existing code, but let's say I want to create a new code. So I will highlight that segment of text again. Now in MaxQDA, you have a few different options for how you can create a new code. So for one, after you've highlighted that segment, you can right click on it and you can select code with new code. And I'll do that for us. So here it is prompting me for what I want to call that code. So I will say that our code is unhelpful for nonverbal. So I'll just code it as unhelpful for nonverbal. So then note the software gives me a few other options down here. So I'll come down to this code memo and I click that little arrow to make it bigger. So this code memo is what I use to define each code as I'm creating it in the software. So I'm just going to define this. I will say it's comments about the training being not helpful for nonverbal communication. And then I'll click OK. So if we come down to the code system, here's the code that I just added. So unhelpful for nonverbal. And note that if you're looking at the code system, we have this little yellow box over here, and that is that code memo. That's the definition. So the reason I like this so much is because, for one, it keeps track of your code book for you. If you want to use that code again, if you just hover over this, it pops up that definition. So it's a way to, improve reliability. I mean, just within yourself, sometimes it's hard to keep track of codes, much less with other people. So I hover over that. I see that we define this as comments about the training being not helpful for learning nonverbal communication. So I can then, think, oh yes, that makes sense. So if I wanted to, if I go through another segment of text, I can again, look at that definition by just hovering over this box, and I can just drag that code over and I can apply it. Now, I've also said that you can revise and refine your definitions over time. So if you come to this little yellow box and just double click on it, it pops up here and it's called a code memo in the software, but this is my definition. So at this point, I can edit it. And I might say that, for example, they talked about the module feeling forced and unrealistic. It's hard to type with an audience. All right. So
I think just for Nicole and Alex, I think that that act of putting in our definition is incredibly important, because some of these I've discovered on other studies feel intuitive when you name it, nonverbal communication training, and then you end up with 3 codes that are similar and you can't remember which one was supposed to mean what, and you end up having to recreate the wheel halfway through consensus. So
exactly.
Assume we're all dumb.
I mean, I forget myself actually too, so it's helping me to remember, what I really
I'm including
meant by
myself in the definition of dumb.
I'm here for it.
Fair enough. Now, I've just updated this definition, and one thing that's really hard for many people to get used to in MaxQDA is there's no save button. So if you close this, you just have to trust that it saves. It's saving really with each click, but I'll hover over this again and you can see that it has the updated definition that I've made here. So it does also do a couple things that I find this really helpful. So note it says right here that it was created by me. It has my timestamp. It then says that I modified it a couple of minutes later. So it does create that log of times that definition has been changed. And, sometimes that can be useful as well if you want to make sure, think about, did you really update that definition, and so on. So a few other things about the code book. Again, if you hover over any of these with this little yellow box, it has that code definition. I, again, often have a code called quote, so I would include that here as well. You can also create a code in the code system. It's this little icon for new code. And then at the top of your document browser, these icons, they're getting progressively smaller, but if you hover over these, you can see what they are. So code with a new code, if I click on that, it pops up that same dialog. So you can create a new code by right-clicking, by going up to this little icon at the top, or by coming down to the code system and selecting a new code. So another feature that I want to point out is then, let's say you want to actually get your code book out. So if you come up to reports, so it's this tab for reports, and then you can ask for, in a few different ways, you can ask for your code book. So this is just a manual of all of those different codes. You can come to export and then come to the code system. And here's a way if you want to save it, say in Excel format, you can do that. So I did export code system. I'll check Excel at this point, and I'm just going to call this my code book from February 2nd. And I will save that. So see how it pops up here? It's asking me, do I want to include the memos? So you do, because remember the memos are where I've provided that definition actually. So I'm going to say yes, that I want to include those memos. And then I'm going to come down here to that file and hopefully open it up and you can see it okay. The computer is just being a little slow. All right, so if you look here, let me kind of zoom this in just so you can see it. But this is, again, this is from an existing project. It's a pretty large project, but it sets up here, it has my code system. It has each of these codes that have been applied, the subcodes, and then the memo is what you see right next to it, and that's the definition. It does also give you this final column, and this is the frequency of the code. It's how many times it's been applied. But if you just want to send around, rather than sending the project around, just send around the code book, to make sure people are familiar with it. If you want to, I sometimes do this, you want to print out the code books, you have it on paper in front of you. You can use that feature in order to print it out in front of you and have it ready. So that's something that I use, pretty often actually, and it's something that you can share among the team. I do just find that a lot of people like to have that printed copy as well. So you'll also notice here that I have these codes grouped a little bit. So I have them grouped into parent codes and subcodes. And you can use that in a couple of different ways. So for one, as you're proceeding with your analysis, you could think about using this to sort of group codes into a theme. Or if maybe you just want to group related code, so maybe you have some codes about barriers and some codes about facilitators, you can use these codes and subcodes in order to make that grouping. And it's really easy to do. So see, I have all of these codes and it was just questions, the question prompt from this essay, but let's say I want to group all of those and we'll just call it question. So let me just create a new code here and I will just call it question type. And I will click OK. And let me just pull that out. So, okay, so I have this code for question type, and hopefully you're seeing this, how I'm doing this here. But if you move this around, you can essentially drag and drop and move the position of it. So I have question type here. If I click and hold, I can move it down so I can reposition that if I want. And then if I want to make a code, a subcode under that, I can just grab this, I can drag it to question type, and now it made that a subcode. So I'll just go ahead and take all of these just to show you an example of how you do it. And I'm going to put all of these under question type. So it's just a way to group your codes. There's some times where it could just be helpful too. So for back to the example of the cardiac arrest study. So we had a group of codes about pre-cardiac arrest, during, and then also after. So we took our codes and we sorted them into those different parent codes. And part of it is that it just sort of helped cognitively ease some of the burden of coding, because you can look at a segment of text, think about, oh, here they're talking about activation, that's pre-cardiac arrest. So then you could just go to that set of codes actually and just grab those. So it's just a way to organize your code book a little bit better. So are there any other questions about codes? And I just want to show you one other feature in Max.
It looks like, Tim, you like to almost use coding to tag your transcripts to navigate within them. It would be my interpretation of all of these question codes.
Yeah, sometimes I don't always do that in this particular study, because I wanted to keep track of what prompt it came from. I did tag it. In a general interview, I don't know, it depends. I wouldn't always code the question type. If it's helpful, yeah, to navigate, if you want to just focus on those, then I would recommend doing that. It's just, this was kind of a special situation where I wanted to be able to track by question type.
Okay, because our transcripts are not super long. I think doing a brief scan through them, they don't look horrible by any means. I guess my other question is, and it's sort of related to the example you have up, how useful is it to code demographics? So we have gender related question or themes that we're exploring, and around career selection. Do you think it's going to be useful just to do some general coding of the transcript as male, female, probably be male, female, other, if anyone jumps into that category, and then EM or non-EM? Or do you think we've just got enough, we're small enough to get our arms around it?
Yeah, I mean, you have a couple of different options. You could code it that way, and that's what I did here. Another thing you could do though is you could actually set that up as a variable that's attached to each transcript. So let me show you how to do that. So if you come to this variables tab, and then I'll just ask for a list of document variables. So if you open this up on a project, all of these in red, these are just variables that the system has created, actually. So those are all things that Max QDA does for you. And it's things like, how many coded segments are attached and so on. You can add variables, and all of these in blue are actually variables that I have added. So you'll see things like age and gender. So to add a variable, it's this little icon for new variables. So it's sort of 3 lines, 4 lines, and then a plus. So I'll click on that. And, again, you could call it, whatever you want. So I already have gender, but let's say it's ethnicity. And then you can select what type of variable. Do you want it to be a text or an integer, or, simply a Boolean? I would probably, for something like gender identity, do it as an integer. And then you can even note that it's a categorical variable, actually, and then click OK. So this is kind of like just a variable view, a list of all of the variables, but then you can actually attach data to that. So to get to that, it's called the data editor, and it's this little icon right here. Or again, if you go to variables, and then in the upper left here, it says data editor for document variables. So I'll go ahead and open that, and it looks just like a spreadsheet, actually. So this is where you can go in and you can actually enter that. So here's the ethnicity variable that I just added, and it's all zeros because I haven't put any data into it. But you can just go through and select whichever category is appropriate. So I would recommend doing that because after you've coded the data, you can look at patterns. For instance, you could say that I want to compare, male versus female versus other, for instance, or you want to compare, responses from different ethnicities, and it will actually, allow you to look at for a code segments of text for those different groupings. So it can be really helpful for that comparative analysis. And it's a lot easier to do that if you've added it as a variable as opposed to a code. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Good. All right. So let me show you, one other thing. So I haven't talked about this lower right-hand quadrant here, and this is retrieve segments. So retrieve segments is what you use to query your data. There are more complex analyses and tools, but just for simply getting what you've coded, a very quick but very powerful query, you can do that in retrieve segments. So the way that Max QDA works and the way that these retrieve segments work are through what's called activation. So you activate what documents you want to focus on, and you activate what codes you want to focus on. And then in retrieve segments, it's going to give you those exact segments of text that you've asked for. So I'm going to activate all of these documents from the empathic group. That was our intervention group in this particular study. And then I'm going to come down to these codes about empathic communication. And note, I should have gone through that more slowly. So it's this little circle just to the left of either a group of documents or to each document itself. If you click on that, you can also right click on it and click activate. So if you activate, something has turned red. So if it's red, you know that it's activated. So let's come down to these codes. And let's say I just want to look at all of these codes about empathic communication. And I recommend doing this in kind of chunks, maybe a few codes at a time or even a code by code. But let's just go ahead and activate these. So it built a query really instantly for me in retrieve segments. So here I can go back through. So, if you think of coding as the first step, and then you want to make sense of those codes, look for patterns, here's where you're really able to go back through and look at your data you've parsed out and help to identify those themes. So I can read through all of these codes about empathic communication. Now, if I'm looking at one of these, and this happens often, where you might want to read a quote in context just to get a little bit more information. So in retrieve segments, it actually puts a hyperlink for you to that transcript in that segment of text. So if I click on this, note that it took me to that particular document in this case, and it actually highlighted that exact segment of text. So now I can read it in context if that would be helpful. And then when you're at a point where you're writing reports, let's say that I've activated my quote code, for instance, and I've activated some of these others. You can go through this, you can grab potential quotes that you're going to use in your tables or in your manuscript. You can look here at any information about the role of individuals and really use this in an efficient way to write a manuscript. Any questions about that? And that's just sort of one basic analysis query in Max QDA, but it's really helpful and it's really powerful.
I think this is all really helpful. I actually have a quick question. Sorry to go back on the variables, which was and you might have said this and my internet might have blopped out. Is there a data dictionary so that when you say like race is 1, 2, 3, like you can define it, or is that a separate area of the software?
Yeah, unfortunately, there is not. I wish there was actually, but as of right now, there is no built-in data dictionary for those different categories. So you have to keep track of that on your own.
Okay, that's totally fine. Just to know that that's something to do. Perfect.
Or,
Thank
you
you.
know, it could also be more of just a text description too, just as long as you're consistent. So, you know, you could write, you know, male, female, other, but, you know, it just has to be really consistent, of course, as you're using that.
Yeah, this is some nice functionality you're demonstrating. I mean, I've worked almost exclusively in deduce previously, and we've created some interesting workarounds to do just this. So it's nice to see.
Good, good. I'm glad it's helpful. You know, that's kind of the major features of Max QDA that should get you started as far as importing a document, attaching variables, establishing codes, getting your code book, and then actually applying codes. And then we concluded with these queries that you can use down here. There are other tools. So if you go to visual tools, there are things like a code matrix browser, and then also a relations browser. So a code matrix browser, I can go ahead and show one here. It's a way to sort of compare by documents or by groups, for instance, if you want to. So let's say that I'll go ahead and ask for looking by document, knowing that I'm going to have a bunch of documents because this is a pretty large data set. But I'm only going to focus on activated codes. So I'll click OK just to kind of show you what it is. So here it gives me rows for every code that I have activated. And then the columns are for each transcript. Now, let's say I had these grouped a little bit. Maybe I had them grouped into you know, male or female. You could do something very similar, but it's a way to look just at you know, quick and easy kind of frequencies. So this code working as a team. So it came up here and it came up in this document and so on. If you want to see the segment of text behind that, if you just double click on this, among codes. So you can set this up where you have codes as your rows and then also codes as your columns. So I will have for rows all codes, and I will have I'm just going to have the activated codes as my columns just to kind of show you what it's looking what it will look like. And then type of analysis. So intersection of codes. So this is saying that if there's been some overlap. So I've applied a couple of codes to the same segment of text and there's been any kind of overlap. Or proximity. So I've applied a couple of codes that are just one line apart or somehow near one another. So I'll just click on that just to show you what it looks like. Click OK. So this is really how codes are related. So this I've asked for is the proximity. So I can look through all of my codes as rows and then those ones that I've asked for as columns. So this is saying that I can, you know, just look and I can see some, you know, patterns, for instance. So about useful verbal and nonverbal communication. So that occurred pretty often near a code about empathic communication. These other codes, useful verbal and nonverbal, that occurred pretty often next to a code about cultural perspectives. So that means that you know, we're applying those codes basically about, I've asked for about a line apart in the data set. So it just kind of gives you some sense of patterns and relationships. But as before, if you click on one of these, and then I'll get this out of the way for you, it again builds this query for you so that you're able to then read back through those segments of text. So it's kind of a next step in analysis to learn a little bit more. And for me, after I've coded, as I'm trying to make sense of this, I start with retrieve segments actually. So I just kind of read back through code by code. And then I use the code matrix browser and the code relations browser just to see if there are any, you know, interesting patterns that I might note. And it's really helpful then for thinking about what are some themes, what are some major findings. Any questions about that? I don't want to go too far beyond coding, because some of that, won't come until you've actually coded the data. Okay. So let me just point out one other, in my opinion, helpful feature in MaxQDA, and that's the example file. So if you're on the home tab and you come to open project, and then you'll see all of recent projects that I've opened. But if you come down to example projects, it gives you a list of these examples, and they have them in different languages. But the English life satisfaction, this is just, and I'll click on that. This is just a sample data set that comes with MaxQDA. So if you ever want to just kind of experiment with things, play around with things, you can come to this example data set and know that you're not going to break anything, you're not going to harm anything. And if you ever, have done a lot with this example data set and you want to, just delete it and refresh this, that's actually really easy to do as well. So I find it's really helpful. People tend to like this just for kind of, getting to know the software. And it's nice because it's loaded with data. There are actual interviews in here. There are variables that are attached to these. It's been coded. So it's just a way to kind of get used to the software. All right. Questions or comments about that or about MaxQDA?
I think I'm at a point I just need to play and familiarize myself with the peculiarities of this interface. Nicole, Alex, other thoughts on your end?
I think I'm in a similar place of just needing to kind of import one of our transcripts and play with it and see what shakes out.
Great. Well, I mean, I hope you kind of have what you need in order to do that at this point. So maybe that's good just to sort of experiment, and then, if it would be helpful to chat again, if I can answer any questions, provide any guidance as you're doing that, I'm happy to help.
No, your expertise and willingness to share it is greatly appreciated.
My pleasure. Great. All right.